She sat at the bus stop, knees drawn to her chest, a 6-year-old girl in a torn pink dress, bare feet buried in snow, clutching a threadbare teddy bear like it was the last warm thing on earth. "Daddy said he'd come back," she whispered. "He promised." Hours passed, the snow piled high, her lips turned blue, but she didn't move. She had promised too. Before the funeral, she had a home, a mother who sang, friends who played. Now they just whispered, "She's the sad girl, the one nobody wants." Just as her body began to fall sideways, eyes fluttering shut, a German shepherd barked into the storm. Moments later, a scarred veteran came running, and nothing would be the same again. Winter had tightened its grip on Fairbanks, Alaska. Snow coated the streets like a quiet warning, and the air was bitter enough to bite through gloves. Houses stood still under thick white roofs, and only the faint hum of distant traffic hinted at life. On the edge of town, beside a forgotten bus stop, sat a little girl far too small for the storm closing in around her. She wasn't crying anymore. Her tears had dried and crusted to frost on her cheeks. Her tiny legs dangled off the frozen bench, her feet bare, toes numb and red. She held a frayed teddy bear tightly to her chest, not for warmth, but for memory. Her pink dress, thin and stiff with ice, clung to her bony shoulders. Her tangled blonde hair was matted to her face, and her skin had gone pale in the dim light. "Daddy said he'd come back," she whispered, voice hoarse from cold and silence. She had waited since morning. The donut he gave her for breakfast had long vanished, leaving only the empty wrapper in her small green backpack beside her. It also carried a broken hairbrush, a drawing of a house with a garden, and nothing else. Her eyes, once bright, had dulled into a haze of cold and fatigue. Still, she watched the road. Still, she believed. Her name was Lila Harper, 6 years old, and tonight she was the loneliest child in the world. Somewhere deeper in the woods beyond the road, a bark rang out. It was sharp, purposeful, not the wandering sound of a stray, but the urgent cry of a dog trained to find. And seconds later, a large figure sprinted into view, fur bristling, nostrils flaring. A German shepherd, broad and muscular, coated in black and brown fur flecked with snow, bounded toward the bus stop like he was tracking the end of a thread pulled too tight. His name was Ranger, 5 years old, once a military working dog in Kandahar, now the loyal shadow of the man limping behind him. That man was Daniel Hartley, 45, a retired Army staff sergeant and a war-worn silhouette of who he once was. His gait was uneven, favoring his left leg, the result of an IED 10 years earlier. A thick parka clung to his broad shoulders. His face, weathered and angular, was framed by a salt and pepper beard that hadn't seen a razor in days. A pale scar ran from his right temple to his cheekbone, making his already sharp features even more severe. But it was his eyes that told the whole story. Eyes too tired for a man his age. Eyes that never stopped scanning, even now. He hadn't meant to be here. PTSD didn't care for intention. When the nightmares crept in, he walked. Ranger walked with him. Tonight, Ranger had led. The moment Daniel saw the shape on the bench, something inside him snapped to full alert. His boots sank into snow as he rushed forward. "Jesus," he muttered, his voice raw from disuse. The girl looked like a porcelain doll abandoned in a snow globe. He dropped to his knees beside her. "Hey," he said softly, unsure whether to raise his voice. "Hey, sweetheart." She didn't move. He touched her shoulder, stiff, cold. Her eyelids fluttered. "I waited. Daddy said I had to," she mumbled. Daniel's heart lurched. He pulled off his parka and wrapped it around her tiny frame, lifting her gently into his arms. She barely stirred, but her hand clutched the bear tighter. "Ranger!" he barked. The dog spun and began trotting toward the trail back to the cabin. Daniel followed, legs heavy, chest burning. The snow was waist-deep in some places, but the girl's weight was feather-light. Too light. She shivered once in his arms and whispered, "I didn't go anywhere. I was good." "I know," Daniel said, voice quiet. "You did exactly what he asked." The walk back to the cabin was a blur. One boot in front of the other, every step fueled by adrenaline. The cabin was hidden, off the grid, tucked behind a line of spruce trees, and built decades ago by a man who thought the world would end. Daniel had just inherited it, and learned how to survive inside it. He kicked open the door with his boot and moved inside. Ranger padded in first, circling near the small wood stove in the corner, while Daniel set the girl on the cot closest to the fire. He pulled off his gloves and checked her hands. Raw, slightly frostbitten. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow. He worked fast. More blankets, warm compresses, tea sweetened with honey. The girl stirred. Her eyes opened slightly. "Where's Daddy?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Daniel crouched beside the bed. He didn't answer right away. "He told me to wait there," she said, eyes cloudy. "He said he was coming back. He promised." Daniel swallowed hard. "Do you remember your name?" She hesitated, then nodded. Lila Harper." "That's a beautiful name," he said. He could see she didn't know whether to trust him, but she was too tired to resist, too cold to be afraid. The room smelled faintly of pine and old smoke. The only sound was the fire crackling and Ranger's breathing. The dog sat beside the cot now, his head low, watching the girl as if he'd been assigned a new mission. Daniel stood and walked to the kitchen corner, running the faucet until warm water sputtered out. He filled a kettle and set it on the stove. His hands shook as he opened the cupboard for soup. He hadn't seen a child this vulnerable since before, since his niece, since the war, since everything fell apart. He pressed a hand against the edge of the counter and exhaled slowly. Behind him, Lila whispered something again. "Don't tell Daddy I left. He'll be mad," he said. "Good girls wait." Daniel turned around, his voice cracking. "You were good, Lila. You waited longer than most grown-ups ever could." She blinked at him. A pause. "Is he coming back?" Daniel knelt again. He didn't lie, but he didn't answer either. Instead, he said, "You're safe now. That's what matters." And she closed her eyes. The fire cracked and hissed inside the cast-iron stove, its warmth creeping slowly across the small cabin, as if afraid to disturb the silence. Outside, snow continued to fall in a thick, muffled curtain, blanketing the world in white. Inside, time moved differently. Slower, quieter, like it knew not to interrupt something fragile. Lila lay curled on the cot, wrapped in thick wool blankets, her tiny fingers still gripping the ear of her worn teddy bear. Her face was no longer blue, though her cheeks held a dull redness, the kind that came from hours spent frozen before the warmth returned. Ranger lay close to her feet, head on his paws, eyes half closed but still alert. He hadn't moved since she was brought in. Daniel sat across the room in a battered wooden chair, elbows on knees, phone in hand. He stared at the cracked screen, thumb hovering over the dial button. After a long moment, he pressed it and raised the phone to his ear. "Fairbanks Police Department," came a woman's voice, firm but polite. "Yeah, this is Daniel Hartley. I'm a veteran living off Ranger Ridge. Found a little girl tonight. She was alone, bus stop out by County Road 12. A pause. "Sir, can you confirm her condition?" "She's alive. Cold, weak, probably 6 years old. Name's Lila Harper. Says her dad told her to wait, all day." Another pause. Then, "We're in the middle of a weather lockdown, Mr. Hartley. All roads are closed past the main highway. No units can reach you tonight." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Understood. But someone needs to know she's here. We'll alert social services and the sheriff's office. Do you have a safe place to keep her overnight?" "I've got a stove, food, and a dog that'll bark before anything else does." "Then keep her warm and stable. Someone will come by morning if the road's open." The call ended. Daniel didn't move for a long moment. Then he slowly stood, walked over to the small kitchen shelf, and pulled down a can of chicken soup. As he filled a pot with water, the soft rustling of fabric caught his attention. Lila had stirred. Her eyes blinked open slowly. She looked around, still half in a dream. "Mr. Teddy's not cold anymore," she mumbled. Daniel turned back to the stove. "Neither are you." She sat up with effort. "This isn't where we live." "No," he said gently, "but it's safe." Her voice was scratchy. "Daddy said not to go with strangers." "You didn't," Daniel replied. "My dog found you. He doesn't take no for an answer." Lila looked over at Ranger, who lifted his head slightly and thumped his tail once. She offered a tiny smile. "He smells like campfire and snow." "That's accurate," Daniel said. He stirred the pot quietly. "You hungry?" She nodded. "Can I have soup?" He brought her a steaming mug with careful hands. She cradled it, inhaling the warmth like it was the most magical thing she'd ever held. After a few sips, she whispered, "My mommy made soup when I was sick." Daniel sat back down, his knees popping. "You want to tell me about her?" Lila stared into her mug. She had golden hair, not like mine. She could sing really soft, like bedtime clouds. "What happened?" She hesitated. Then, voice low, "She got tired, really tired. Then the hospital took her. Daddy cried a lot after that. He said we had to move, but we didn't have a place yet." "So you've been moving around?" "Yeah, Daddy said we were looking for a new home, but it kept being not yet." Daniel rubbed his temples. He'd heard stories like this before. Too many. "Was he kind to you?" he asked gently. Lila nodded slowly. "He's just sad." Daniel glanced toward the window, where the snow had piled halfway up the glass. "Did he say when he'd be back?" She shook her head. "He said not to ask questions, just be brave." Daniel looked back at her. "And you were?" She blinked at him. "Do you think he'll know to find me here?" Daniel took a breath. "If he's looking, he'll know someone brought you somewhere safe." The clock ticked quietly. Then came a knock at the door. Sharp, urgent. Ranger jumped to his feet, barking once, ears perked. Daniel moved quickly, hand instinctively brushing his side where a gun used to rest, though now it was just habit. He opened the door to find a woman bundled in a long green parka, her red hair pulled into a tight braid, snow crusted to her boots. Her face was windburned but calm, with gray-blue eyes that narrowed with focus. She held up a badge. "Grace Linwood, Social Services. I hiked in from the ranger station." She looked about 35, lean and athletic, with a no-nonsense posture. Her skin was fair but freckled, her voice calm even under stress. "Figured you'd need backup," she said, stepping inside as Ranger gave a low sniff and approved with a soft tail wag. Daniel nodded. "You're earlier than expected. I don't like waiting when kids are involved." Grace took one look at Lila and crouched in front of her, voice softening. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Grace. You're very brave. You know that?" Lila blinked at her. "I don't feel brave." "That's what makes you even braver," Grace said, offering a warm smile. She unpacked a small satchel, pulling out a first aid kit, thermal blanket, and a packet of crayons. "Is it okay if I check your fingers and toes?" she asked. Lila nodded. Daniel watched as Grace worked. She was efficient and gentle, someone who had done this too many times to count. He respected that. After checking vitals, Grace stepped aside. "She's stable, a bit frostbitten on the fingers, but no permanent damage." "She told me some things," Daniel said, "about her mom, about moving around a lot." Grace sighed. "These cases are always hard. Parents who mean well but fall apart. We'll have to find out who has custody." "I'll stay with her tonight," Daniel said. "You can't hike back in this storm." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Fair enough. I'll report in and camp here if needed." Lila had curled back under the blanket, her eyes drooping. Before drifting off, she whispered toward Daniel, barely audible. "Will Daddy know where I am?" He moved closer, his voice low and steady. "He'll know you're safe, and that's what matters tonight." The snow had finally stopped. By morning, the sky above Fairbanks opened into a pale, washed-out blue, tinged with pink where the sun peeked over the horizon. The storm had passed, but left behind a landscape transformed, hushed, buried, clean. Pines bent under the weight of snow, and the road was no longer a road, but a narrow trench Daniel carved out with each careful step of his boots. Lila walked beside him, her small hand tucked into his gloved one. She wore a puffy coat far too big, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, the hem brushing her knees. Her blonde hair had been gently brushed and tied back into a loose ponytail by Grace that morning, and though her cheeks were red from the cold, there was color in them now. Her green backpack, light as it was, still hung from one shoulder. Ranger padded ahead, tail alert, weaving through the snowpath like he remembered the way. Daniel's sister lived just beyond the first ridge on the edge of town, far enough for quiet, close enough to call a neighbor if needed. Her home was a small cedar-sided cottage surrounded by a fenced garden that, in summer, bloomed with roses and mint and sunflowers. Now, it was blanketed in snow, the trellises bare and frozen, the garden statues half submerged in white. Margaret Hartley opened the front door before they knocked. She stood with both hands on her hips, her silver-gray hair swept up into a neat bun, wire-rimmed glasses perched low on her nose. At 68, she had the kind of presence that filled a room without saying a word. Tall and thin, with long limbs and a graceful posture born from years of yoga and stubborn pride, Margaret looked like the kind of woman who could talk a bear out of its cave. Her face, lined gently at the corners, softened the moment she saw the little girl. "You must be Lila," she said warmly. Her voice was steady, with a faint rasp that gave it character rather than age. "Come inside, sweetheart. You look like you walked out of a snow globe." Lila hesitated, then stepped forward, boots crunching. Ranger followed, but waited at the door, tail swaying. Margaret reached down and rubbed his head. "I see you brought the bodyguard." Daniel gave a faint smile as he stepped in behind. He doesn't take days off. The cabin was warm and lived in, filled with soft light from frosted windows. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with worn paperbacks and framed photos of past family holidays. A fireplace crackled in the corner, where an armchair sat with a wool blanket draped neatly over it. On the coffee table, a plate of buttered toast and a mug of hot cocoa waited. "I figured you'd be cold," Margaret said, handing the mug to Lila. "It's mostly marshmallow, don't worry." Lila took it with both hands and sat carefully on the edge of the couch. Ranger curled up at her feet. Margaret motioned Daniel toward the kitchen. "She slept through most of the night," he whispered once they were alone. "Told me her mom's gone. Said her dad was looking for a home." Margaret's lips thinned, and left her at a bus stop in a snowstorm. She still believes he's coming back. "She's 6, Margaret said gently. "Of course she does." Back in the living room, Lila had begun looking around. Her eyes landed on a set of colored pencils and blank paper on the table, just beside her cocoa. "Would you like to draw?" Margaret asked. Lila looked up, unsure. "No rules, no right or wrong. Just draw whatever your heart feels." Lila reached for a pencil. Over the next 20 minutes, as the adult spoke in quiet tones in the kitchen, Lila sat hunched over the page. When Margaret returned, she found the girl completely focused, tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth. "Can I see?" she asked softly. Lila nodded. The picture showed a bench under a snowfall. A little girl with yellow hair sat on it, beside a teddy bear. A tall man was walking away, a suitcase in hand, his back turned. Above the whole scene, a sun peeked from behind a cloud. Margaret knelt beside her. "That's a beautiful drawing." "That's me," Lila said. "Daddy went to find a house for us. I just needed to wait." "And did he say when he'd come back?" "No," she said, eyes still on the paper. "But he said good girls wait." Margaret reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Waiting can be hard, especially when it's cold, but sometimes it's okay to stop waiting if it means staying safe." Lila looked at her, uncertain. "What if he comes back and I'm not there?" "Then we'll make sure he knows where to find you," Margaret promised. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Lila didn't respond, but she slid the drawing across the table like an offering. Margaret stood and walked back to Daniel, who had made tea and was watching from the doorway. "She's holding on by a thread," she said under her breath, "but she's still holding. She asked me last night if her dad would know to find her." "And what did you say?" "That he'd know she was safe." Margaret's eyes met his. Was that a promise or a lie? "I don't know yet," Daniel answered, "but it's the only thing I could say." Outside, the snow had begun to melt under the first light of day. Inside, a little girl folded her drawing and placed it in her backpack. For now, she wasn't on a bench. She was somewhere warm, with marshmallows and paper and people who didn't leave. It was mid-morning when Daniel stood on Margaret's front porch, bundled in his olive coat, a knit scarf tight around his neck. Snow still blanketed the town of Fairbanks, though the roads had been plowed into narrow, muddy corridors. The sun cast pale light over the rooftops, glinting off icicles that hung like glass teeth from gutters. Ranger sat beside him, posture straight, tail swishing slowly across the wood planks, nose occasionally raised to test the air. He was restless, and Daniel knew why. Lila was inside, curled up on the couch with Margaret, coloring quietly. She had barely spoken that morning, her voice hushed, as if it might break something. Margaret, always patient, let her draw without questions. The picture she held now showed a man with no face, walking away into a storm. Daniel tugged on his gloves and looked down at Ranger. "Let's go find some answers." They walked toward town. Ranger led, his body moving with purpose, following invisible cues only he could sense. Daniel had learned long ago not to question the dog's instincts. He had found more missing men and hidden bombs with that nose than any piece of tech the Army ever built. Daniel's destination wasn't a police station or a shelter. It was the Red Fern Motel, a squat, L-shaped building that hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The paint on the siding peeled in long, dry curls, and the neon vacancy sign blinked half-heartedly through the morning haze. The kind of place where people went when they had nowhere else. Inside, the front office smelled faintly of cigarette ash and old coffee. A bell dinged as the door closed behind them. Behind the counter sat a heavy-set man with thinning blonde hair, wearing a green plaid flannel shirt and a name tag that read Ed. He looked up with suspicion. "Can I help you?" Daniel nodded. "I'm looking for someone who might have stayed here a few weeks ago. Carl Harper. Medium build, dark hair, traveling with a little girl." Ed snorted. "You a cop?" "No," Daniel said, voice even. "I'm the guy who found the girl." Ed hesitated, then leaned back in his creaky chair. "Room 9. They were here. 3-4 days. Paid cash. Left without notice." "Did he say where he was going?" "He said he was heading for Anchorage. Talked a lot about starting over. Didn't sound too stable, if I'm honest. Spent more time talking to the bottle than to his kid." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You remember anything else?" "Yeah, said something about catching the bus from Monroe Terminal. That's about 30 miles south." Daniel thanked him and left. Ranger was already pacing, waiting to move. As they reached the main street, Daniel pulled out his phone and called Margaret. "I'm heading south. I think I know where he left from." "You sure you want to go alone?" Margaret's voice crackled through the cold air. "Yeah, Lila doesn't need to hear what I might find." Daniel drove the distance in silence, Ranger in the passenger seat, eyes sharp on the horizon. The Monroe bus terminal wasn't much more than a concrete slab with 4 benches and a vending machine that didn't work. The ticket booth sat behind smudged glass, and the lot beyond it was half-melted slush. Inside the booth was a woman in her 50s, dark skin, short salt and pepper hair under a knit cap. Her name tag read Nina. She looked up from her crossword puzzle with a smile that faded when she saw Daniel's expression. "Let me guess," she said. "You're not here to catch a bus." "I'm looking for someone who was." He showed her a photo on his phone, an old one from Grace's database showing Carl and a younger Lila. Nina leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "Yeah, I remember him. Drank a lot of coffee, smelled like whiskey. The girl, sweet thing, sat on the bench with a coloring book. He kept checking the schedule, looking nervous." Daniel leaned in. "Did you see them leave?" "Not together," Nina said. "He boarded the 6 p.m. to talk, said he had a job lead. She didn't go with him." Daniel's stomach dropped. What happened to her? "She stayed on the bench for a bit, then a woman showed up. Looked tired, thin, maybe mid-30s, wore a parka too big for her. They talked, and she took the girl away." Daniel blinked. "What?" Nina nodded slowly. "I thought she was the mom. She seemed, I don't know, gentle, protective. Said the girl was just waiting for her to get off work." "Did you catch a name?" "She signed the bus log. I keep a backup." Nina reached under the desk and pulled a dog-eared clipboard. She flipped through pages, finger tapping on a name halfway down. Sarah Langley. Daniel stared at the name. "You remember what she looked like?" Nina nodded. "About 5'9", slender, wore glasses, hair was dark, pulled back, skin was pale, maybe a little sickly, but her eyes, kind. Tired, but kind." He jotted the name down, heart thudding. Something didn't add up. He thanked her and walked back to the truck, where Ranger had his paws pressed against the window, ears perked. Daniel opened the door and sat heavily. "Carl didn't leave her alone," he murmured. "He left her with someone." He turned the ignition, but didn't drive. Instead, he sat back and stared at the snow, piecing together a picture that was no longer clear-cut. The sun hung low in the pale sky, casting long shadows across the snowbanks that lined the street. Daniel steered the truck carefully through the residential district of Fairbanks, passing rows of modest homes and weather-worn porches until they reached the edge of town. The Willow Pines care home sat quietly behind a wrought iron gate, its sloped roof sagging under the weight of last week's storm. The building, though plain, had a neatness to it, Windows lined with lace curtains, a faded welcome sign painted with cheerful pine trees, and smoke curling gently from the brick chimney. Lila sat in the back seat, her small hands cradling her bear like it was made of glass. She wore a clean gray wool coat that Margaret had given her, a little too big in the sleeves, but warm. Her golden hair was tied into 2 small braids by Margaret that morning, though some strands had already escaped. Her expression was unreadable, quiet, cautious, a tension in her brow that Daniel had come to recognize. Ranger sat beside her in the back, his dark amber eyes shifting between the road and the girl, as if monitoring both with equal care. Margaret had made the arrangements that morning. "They've been asking," she had said softly. The minute I mentioned Lila's name, they broke down. Daniel hadn't said much. He had only nodded. He knew how grief softened some people and hardened others. Inside Willow Pines, the air smelled faintly of chamomile tea and hand lotion. An older nurse, maybe in her 60s, greeted them at the door. Her name tag read, Dolores. She had short silver hair tucked behind her ears, warm eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a slow, practiced voice. "You must be Lila," she said, kneeling down to the child's level. "They're waiting for you just inside. Would you like to come with me?" Lila glanced at Daniel, who gave her a gentle nod. Ranger stood and moved with her, but Dolores held up a hand. "We don't usually allow dogs inside, even well-behaved ones." Daniel was about to protest when Dolores added, "But this one can stay, just this once." They followed her down a hallway lit with soft yellow lights. The walls were decorated with children's drawings and paper snowflakes. The farther they walked, the slower Lila's steps became. When they reached the common room, a fire crackled in the hearth. 2 figures sat near it, an elderly man in a flannel shirt and wool cardigan, and a woman with snow-white hair pulled into a bun, wrapped in a crocheted blanket of faded blues and greens. Walter and June McKinley, Lila's grandparents. Walter looked up first. He was tall even in his chair, his posture still straight, though his face was etched with lines that hinted at long hours spent in silence. His skin was ruddy, and his hands, resting on his knees, were broad and calloused. Once a carpenter, Margaret had told Daniel. June was smaller, her eyes bright behind clouded lenses, her voice thin but full of longing. When they saw Lila, both stood, slowly, stiffly, and reached for her. "Lila!" June's voice cracked. "Oh, baby girl." Lila didn't run. She stood still for a moment, then took a small step forward, then another. And then she walked straight into June's arms. The old woman cradled her as if trying to hold back the time they had lost. Walter leaned down next, wrapping his long arms around both. His hands trembled slightly as they touched the girl's shoulder. "We've missed you so much," he said, "every single day." Lila didn't say anything at first. She clung to them tightly, her fingers digging into June's blanket. But after a long pause, her voice came, barely a whisper. "If you love me, why didn't Daddy let me see you?" The question cut the room in half. Silence fell like snow. Walter and June exchanged a look, one full of regret and something heavier. June pulled back gently, her hands cupping Lila's cheeks. "Because he was protecting you. He was hurting too, sweetheart. He didn't always make the right choices." "But I was alone," Lila said, eyes brimming. Walter's voice was low. "And we're sorry. Truly sorry. We wanted to be there, we did. But we're not young anymore, Lila. And after your mom passed, your daddy was different. He didn't answer our calls. He kept moving." June nodded slowly. "And we're not strong enough to take care of a child full time. But we want to be part of your life, if you'll let us." Lila looked down at her bear, then back up at them. "You promise?" "Cross our hearts," June said. Daniel stood quietly by the doorway, Ranger sitting at his side. The dog hadn't taken his eyes off Lila since she entered. He could feel Margaret's words echoing in his head. Sometimes, children believe they're forgotten before they even know they're missed. Dolores brought in 2 mugs of cocoa, and Lila sat between her grandparents on the couch. She drank slowly, her fingers wrapped tight around the warmth. They showed her old photo albums. One picture was of her as a baby in June's arms, another of Carl as a boy building a treehouse with Walter. Daniel excused himself and stepped outside for air. The cold bit at his cheeks, but he didn't mind. Sometimes, a man needed the sting of winter to remind him he was still breathing. Ranger followed, his paws crunching against the packed snow. Daniel sat on the front steps and stared at the empty sky. "She deserves better than this mess," he muttered. Ranger responded with a low whine and rested his head on Daniel's knee. The snow had settled like a sigh over Fairbanks when the call came. Daniel stood on Margaret's porch, splitting logs in the crisp morning air, the rhythmic sound of axe meeting wood giving him a strange sense of order. Ranger sat nearby, his breath fogging in short clouds, eyes half-lidded but alert. Margaret opened the front door with a phone in her hand, her expression unreadable. "It's Officer Ruiz from Albuquerque," she said quietly. "They've found Carl." Daniel lowered the axe slowly. He hadn't heard that name aloud in days. Not since Lila's visit to the care home, where her innocence had slowly begun to untangle the pain her father left behind. Margaret handed him the phone. "He's in custody." Officer Ruiz's voice was efficient, but not unkind. "We picked him up trying to cross into Texas with forged documents. No resistance. He's tired, homeless. Says he's been living out of his truck for the last few weeks. Gave us a fake name, but his prints matched." Daniel exhaled. "And the girl? Did he say anything?" "Quite a bit, actually," Ruiz said. "He asked about her. Said he knew someone would find her. He just hoped it'd be someone better than him." Carl Harper sat in a small, windowless interview room, handcuffed to a steel table. He was 39, but life had weathered him early. His brown hair had thinned and grayed at the temples. His eyes were red-rimmed and sunken. His clothes were stained, his hands rough and cracked from exposure. A short beard shadowed his angular jaw, more out of neglect than style. Detective Ruiz, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and a blunt but not cruel manner, slid the recorder forward. "You know why you're here?" Carl nodded. "The ID, I get it." "You know we found your daughter?" That made him flinch. His lips tightened, and for a moment his jaw worked as if chewing on words too bitter to swallow. "She's safe?" he finally asked. "Yes, warm, fed, with people who care." Carl closed his eyes. "Good." Ruiz leaned forward. "Why did you leave her?" Carl opened his mouth, then shut it. He shook his head like a man shaking off water, then looked Ruiz in the eye. "You ever watch someone you love waste away?" he asked. "My wife, Sarah. She was strong, smarter than me, brighter, but the cancer, it took her fast. By the end, I couldn't protect Lila from the screaming, the morphine, the prayers that went unanswered." He wiped at his nose with the back of his hand. "After she passed, I tried. I swear I did. But Lila started asking for answers I didn't have. Why her mom wasn't coming back. Why I cried at night. I lost my job. Couldn't afford rent. Every time I looked at her, I saw Sarah dying. And I started to believe Lila would be better off without me." Ruiz's tone didn't soften. "So you left her. Alone. In a snowstorm." Carl nodded slowly. "I told her to wait at the bus stop. I told her I'd come back. I thought maybe someone good would find her. Someone with more left to give." "You abandoned a 6-year-old child." Carl stared at the floor. "And I'll carry that every day for the rest of my life." Later that afternoon, he agreed to sign the papers relinquishing all parental rights. Back in Fairbanks, Daniel sat in Margaret's living room as she hung up the phone. Lila was in the next room, painting with watercolors, completely unaware of the quiet resolution happening behind walls. Margaret turned toward Daniel. "It's done. He signed." Daniel didn't speak at first. His face was hard, his knuckles white around the coffee mug in his hands. Ranger lay at his feet, tail thumping once against the wooden floor. "He left her in the cold," Daniel finally said, "and hoped the universe would just sort it out." Margaret's voice was calm. "Some people break in ways they can't fix." Daniel stood and walked to the window. Outside, the wind had picked up again. The trees swayed slightly under the gray sky. "He gave up," Daniel said, "but I won't." He glanced back into the room where Lila was singing quietly to herself, painting a tree with impossibly wide branches. Her teddy bear sat on the table beside her, propped up with a small scarf Ranger had brought her the day before. She was healing, slowly, piece by piece. Margaret came to stand beside him. She's not alone anymore. Snow still clung stubbornly to the edges of Fairbanks, but there was a softness to it now, like winter itself was beginning to loosen its grip. The sky had turned a pale, forgiving blue, and sunlight filtered gently through the courthouse windows. Inside, the air was still and solemn, wooden benches, the faint creak of boots on tile, and a judge's voice echoing off the walls like a sermon. Margaret Hartley sat upright in the front row, her weathered hands folded tightly in her lap. Her gray hair was pinned back in a neat twist, revealing a face both kind and dignified, lined from years of compassion and sorrow. She wore her favorite maroon wool coat, one that had seen funerals and baby showers alike, and beside her sat Lila in a fresh dress the color of melting snow, with a yellow ribbon in her hair and her gnarled teddy clutched to her chest. Daniel stood behind them, tall and quiet in a dark jacket, his posture ramrod straight from decades of discipline. His bearded face remained unreadable to most, though Margaret had learned to see through the armor. Ranger lay obediently at his feet, tail brushing lightly against the marble floor, amber eyes alert but calm. Judge Beverly Saunders presided over the hearing, a woman in her mid-60s, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, with silver curls and a no-nonsense voice. She had seen many custody cases in her 30-year career, but something about this one softened the steel in her gaze. "Mrs. Hartley," she said, scanning the forms, "you're petitioning for permanent guardianship of Lila Harper, age 6. Are you prepared to assume full legal and physical custody, along with all responsibilities therein?" Margaret rose slowly. "Yes, Your Honor, I am." "And do you have the means to care for the child?" "I receive a teacher's pension and social work benefits. My home is stable, and my heart is more than ready." There was a pause. Lila looked up at her, then stepped forward, her little hand curling into Margaret's. Her voice was barely a whisper. "If you're going to be my family, can I call you Grandma?" Margaret's eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She simply knelt to Lila's height, held her shoulders gently, and said, "You can call me anything, my darling, but yes, Grandma sounds perfect." The courtroom hushed. Even the bailiff, an older man with a white mustache and stiff shoulders, lowered his gaze, blinking too quickly. Ranger's tail thumped once against the bench. Judge Saunders adjusted her glasses, hiding her own subtle smile. "Then it is so ordered. Guardianship is granted to Margaret Hartley, effective immediately. Lila Harper is now in your care, and may the law stand beside you in all that follows." A quiet cheer broke out behind them. Daniel exhaled slowly. Margaret hugged Lila tightly, burying her face in the girl's hair. Ranger let out a low huff, stood, and pressed his head against Lila's hip as if sealing the moment. Outside, the snow had begun to sparkle in the late morning light. Daniel, Margaret, and Lila stood on the courthouse steps as a photographer from the local paper, the Fairbanks Gazette, lifted his camera. "Mind if I take a photo?" he asked. "It's not every day we get a story like this. We could all use a happy one." Daniel hesitated, but Lila beamed and tugged on Margaret's hand. Margaret smiled. One photo. The photographer, a young man named Colin with sandy hair and a woolen scarf wrapped around his neck, lifted the lens. "Say home." Lila's voice was clear. "Home." Click. That afternoon, Margaret took Lila home in her old station wagon, with Ranger curled in the back beside her. Daniel followed behind in his truck, silent as the trees. When they reached the small blue house at the edge of town, Lila rushed to the porch, where Margaret had placed a handmade wooden sign beside the door. It read, "Welcome home, Lila." The girl stood still for a moment, eyes wide, then looked back at Daniel and whispered, "Can Ranger stay too?" Daniel stepped up and met Margaret's eyes. He wasn't good with words, but the look they exchanged was simple and clear. "Ranger's always known where he belongs," Margaret said. And just like that, the dog climbed the steps beside Lila, his tail wagging in steady rhythm. She opened the door and let him in first. The garden behind Margaret's house had once been a plain stretch of frozen earth, flanked by birch trees whose branches clawed upward into gray skies. But now, 1 year later, it had become something else entirely. A circle of life etched gently into the snow, where footprints gathered and laughter rang louder than the wind. A small sign read, "Family Day, Hartley Home," pinned between two strings of soft golden lights that twinkled against the pale blue afternoon. Paper lanterns danced in the breeze, and children bundled in thick coats darted between snowmen and pine stumps with candy in their mittens. Daniel stood to the side of it all, as he always did, watchful, quiet, his arms folded across his chest. He had let his beard grow fuller over the winter, streaks of gray weaving into the dark like snow in a river current. He wore a dark navy wool coat, collar turned up, boots thick with salt stains. He wasn't a man of parties, but today wasn't just any day. Ranger sat obediently by his side, tail slowly sweeping the snow behind him. The black and brown German shepherd was now 6, his muzzle flecked with white, but his eyes remained sharp and his loyalty unshaken. Lila, now 7, darted through the crowd in a red knit sweater, scarf dragging behind her like a flag. She was laughing, unapologetically, fully. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her blonde hair tamed into 2 pigtails by Margaret earlier that morning. She stopped short at Daniel's boots, breath fogging into the air, and held something small and wrapped in blue tissue paper. "This is for you," she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow, but took it gently. Inside was a small, smooth river stone, warm from her mittens. 3 words had been carved into it in a child's wobbly hand, inked over carefully. "You found me." Lila looked up. "I didn't finish it on the rock, but I meant you found me when he didn't." Daniel looked down at the stone, then at her. His throat tightened. There were things a soldier could face: gunfire, fire, betrayal, but nothing quite like the raw trust in a child's eyes. He knelt beside her. "You were never lost, Lila. You were just waiting to be seen." Her arms wrapped around his neck, quick and firm. When she pulled away, her voice was bright. "I'm really adopted now. That means this is forever, right?" "Yeah," Daniel said, his voice low. "It's forever." Behind them, Margaret stepped out with 2 mugs of cocoa. She was still a figure of grace and warmth in her late 60s, tall, slim, her silver hair tied back in a forest green shawl. Her laugh carried through the garden like wind chimes. She handed 1 mug to Daniel and ruffled Lila's hair. Guests began gathering for a toast. Friends from the neighborhood, a few caseworkers, a retired judge. Even Colin, the young photographer with tousled hair and a leather camera strap, was there again, capturing a new memory. Margaret clinked her spoon against a glass. "Today marks 1 year since Lila came home," she said. "This garden used to be just snow and silence, but when she arrived, it became something much more." "A jungle!" one kid shouted. "A fairy castle!" another added. Everyone laughed. Margaret continued. "It became a place where new things could grow, where family doesn't mean who you came from, but who chooses to stay." Lila raised her cocoa with both hands. "I waited for someone who never came back," she said, her voice loud and clear. "But then the people I needed came anyway. That's how I knew I was home." Applause rippled through the garden. Daniel, half smiling, raised his mug. "To the people we find in the snow." "To family," Margaret echoed. And as the cheers echoed across the trees, Ranger curled up by Lila's boots. The little girl leaned down and kissed the top of his head. "Good boy," she whispered. "You found me first." The dog's eyes closed, chest rising slow and steady, as if even he understood. The mission was complete. Sometimes miracles don't arrive on wings or thunder. Sometimes they come in the shape of a child's whisper, a man with old wounds and quiet eyes, or a dog who refuses to give up in the snow. Lila waited, not knowing if anyone would ever come, but God had already set something in motion. A wounded soldier, a loyal K-9, a quiet town covered in white, and love that would not pass her by again. If you believe that no one is ever truly forgotten, that even in the coldest places heaven still watches, then this story was meant for you. May God bless every soul who watches this. Share this with someone who might need a reminder that love still finds us, that family can be chosen, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest prayers. Drop a comment if you believe in second chances. Subscribe for more stories where light finds the lost. And if you're reading this now, you're part of the miracle too.